10 Facts about Hart Island. 1. Historical use. Hart Island has a history dating back to the Civil War era when it was used as a training ground for the Union Army. However, its most infamous use began in the late 19th century as a potter's field, where the deceased without known next of kin were buried. 2. Mass burials. Over 1 million people are believed to be buried on Hart Island, making it one of the largest public burial grounds in the United States. The deceased were often buried in mass graves, with multiple individuals interred in a single plot. 3. Unclaimed bodies. Many of the deceased buried on Hart Island were unclaimed by family members, often due to poverty, homelessness, or a lack of resources to provide a proper burial. 4. Anonymous burials. The burial process on Hart Island is often anonymous, with simple wooden caskets or even no caskets at all. Headstones typically bear only numbers, making it difficult to identify individual graves. 5. Inaccessible to the public. Hart Island has long been inaccessible to the public. It is controlled by the New York City Department of Correction, and access is restricted due to its use as a burial ground and concerns about potential disruptions. 6. Controversial conditions. Reports of controversial burial practices and concerns about respectful treatment of the deceased have raised questions about the conditions on Hart Island. 7. Erosion and preservation. Erosion caused by weather and rising sea levels threatens the stability of Hart Island's shoreline and the preservation of its historical records. 8. Memorial efforts. There have been ongoing efforts to memorialize the individuals buried on Hart Island and provide a more dignified and accessible way for family members to pay their respects. 9. Haunted legends. The island's history has led to haunting legends and ghost stories, with some believing it to be haunted by the restless spirits of the deceased. 10. Public awareness. In recent years, there has been increased public awareness and advocacy for changes in the treatment of the deceased on Hart Island, with calls for more transparency and respect in the burial process. One significant event in the history of Hart Island occurred in the early 1980s when the island's condition and the treatment of the deceased buried there came under intense scrutiny, leading to calls for reform and greater transparency. In 1985, investigative journalist Joel S. Hirschhorn published a series of articles in the New York Times that exposed the dire conditions and controversial burial practices on Hart Island. Hirschhorn's reporting revealed issues such as mass graves, the use of bulldozers to bury bodies, and a lack of respect for the deceased. The articles sparked public outrage and led to increased scrutiny of the burial practices on Hart Island. Advocacy groups, concerned citizens, and families of the deceased pushed for reforms to ensure a more dignified and respectful treatment of the deceased, particularly for those who had been indigent or unclaimed. As a result of this public pressure, changes were made to improve the conditions on Hart Island. Efforts were made to maintain better records of those interred, and there were discussions about creating a more accessible and respectful memorial for the deceased buried there. Hirschhorn's investigative reporting and the subsequent advocacy efforts shed light on the need for reform in the treatment of the deceased on Hart Island, marking a pivotal moment in the island's history and the ongoing discussions surrounding its use as a burial ground.